So today, have a special guest, author Haley Warren. Um, we're gonna talk about her first novel, Bad Daughter, which was released back in August this year, and I got the chance to read it, and I'm excited to talk to you about it. So, thank you again for agreeing to chat. Hope everything is going well.
Thanks for having me. Super happy to chat.
Cool. And if you don't mind, I would love to just read the first two pages.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So I guess this is kind of like the prologue of it. Okay. So, well, this is the cover. A daughter. My father was a complicated man, or at least that's what I used to say. In the 4 years since he died, I've spent a lot of time alone in my head with ample time to think, and I've come to the conclusion that he was never actually a complicated man. I was a bad daughter. The sweltering heat of the August long weekend stuck to my skin and caused my hair to curl around my face. The cold air of the hospital only served to make me feel clammy all over. I rounded the corner of the unit, and there he was. Suddenly, there was no air left in my lungs. I lurched forward, reaching out and grabbing my mother's forearm. My father was lying in the hospital bed, all ashen skin, tubes, and wires. I couldn't see where one ended and the others began. I cocked my head, taking a tentative step forward toward the doorway. His face was narrowed to a pointed chin that had no business on his previously handsome face, and his eyes were sunken, the hollows around them gray. His sister was sitting beside him, hunched forward in a blue plastic chair, clutching my father's limp hand. Flakes of skin and white film coated his lips, a tube protruding from in between them. His chest rose and fell mechanically. I knew the machines were beeping, signaling different things about the inner workings of his body, but all I could hear was the sound of my heart beating in my ears. It was a Thursday. He died the following Tuesday. His eyes opened one more time when I came to sit beside him and hold his hand, and all I could think was, my fault, my fault, my fault.
You have a great reading voice. I feel like you could get into audiobooks.
It's funny you say that. I started recording Frankenstein just because it's a public domain book.
Yeah, I can
To
totally
practice.
see that for you. You've got a great audiobook voice. Definitely lends to podcasting too, but for sure you'd be great at doing that.
Thank you. So yeah, it was those first two pages that got me hooked because it sets the story right away. Um, and just to, I guess, premise the story, it's a story about uh, a Carly, who's the main character in her late 20s, and she, without going into details, blames herself for her father's death. And as you read through the story, she deals with her grief, and you kind of learn the consequences of trying to like hide your problems away under the carpet,
Yeah.
so to speak. So I read this book over 2 months, I think September and October.
Okay.
And normally I like to read it pretty quickly in 2 or 3 weeks, just because of whatever was going on in life. It was busy time. But what was nice about having read that over that 2 month period is that um, it was like coming back to a character, which is good in the sense that you kind of feel closer and you remember the characters
Yeah.
more. But I do remember for the first 2 or 3 weeks, I think like the first third or so of the book, what I was thinking reading it was like it was just frustrating because I was thinking like, come on, just like stop ignoring the problem, just like do something about it. But I mean that in the best way. Like it was written well. So
Oh no, thank you. And interesting you say that because I think I've heard one of two things from people that have read it. Either one, they totally devoured it right away, or very similarly, whether for external or, extenuating circumstances, they took a little longer to read it. And I've heard kind of very similarly to what you're saying, like folks would come back to the book and be like, ah, like you're just looking for her to really, move forward, to open herself up and all of these things. And it takes her a while. Obviously, she can be a bit frustrating to read, I'm sure, in ways she was sort of frustrating to write. I mean that in a good way, very similar to what you said. So
Cool. So this is your first published novel. Did you have other works that you're working on before this?
yeah, so interestingly enough, I mean, I've written my whole life and I've actually shared freely in just various kind of public domain pieces online, previous work, mostly in the form of articles or kind of thought pieces and stuff like that. But I actually started a book in at the start of the pandemic, kind of height of COVID, I think in those first 2 weeks when, we were all staying home to flatten the curve. Totally different book. That's actually my second novel that's coming out in January. But I was actually writing that one off and on throughout the pandemic. And then I just got the idea to write Bad Daughter. It actually was originally born from various essays and things that I had written over the course of my time and my experience caring for my father during his cancer journey. So it's fiction, it's fictionalized, but certainly in some things are inspired by true events. And I just had this idea early last fall, almost a year ago exactly, in a way that I could kind of take those pieces that I had written that were true, more essay style, and turn it into a fiction. And that's kind of where I paused writing the other one for a bit. And I actually wrote Bad Daughter in about, I think, 3 months. Like it was a pretty short period of time.
And is you mentioned 3 months is short. Like, what would be a typical time that you think you would take?
I mean, I think it depends on the author, on the writer and on the subject matter. But I think because I was solely focused on that and I was pretty structured with my writing to get it out quickly. Whereas my other book, I was writing that off and on over the course of 2 years. But that being said, I wasn't focusing on it intentionally the way that I did with Bad Daughter. And it's not a particularly long novel. It is only about, I think it's just under 67,000 words. So that's about kind of mid range for the genre. Sometimes they're a little bit more closer to 75. But I think most folks, at least the ones that I speak to that are other authors, I would say like 6 months to a year is fairly reasonable, unless you can totally donate all of your time and dedicate all of your time to it.
Hmm. Yeah, I love writing. I don't write fiction. I would like to at some point. Right now, I have a blog, so I try to write a couple of pieces a year. Like I wrote one about running a half marathon for myself and like the preparation and what happened with that. And you mentioned that this novel came through some personal essays that you've written about your own
Yeah.
experience caring for your father. Um, so, I mean, it does feel very personal, and I'm wondering, like, for me personally, some things when I write them, it's kind of like a way to relive the experience and kind of come to terms with things. Um, if for this novel, would that have happened during your personal essays and then you just fictionalized it, or was it like both?
I think both. And it's interesting you say that because I've definitely had folks that know me well and knew the experience well at the time that have in many ways kind of tried to pick apart like what's fact versus what's fiction in the book and wondering what was true. And so I do think, when I was writing Bad Daughter, I didn't find it to be particularly difficult to write in the sense that I wasn't necessarily reliving all of my emotions or anything like that. Like I felt not detached from them, but it felt perhaps very matter of fact because I was basing it off of these personal essays. But it's actually been since I wrote it, since it's been published and kind of out in the world, that upon reflection, I do think writing it was quite cathartic for me. I think about my feelings around my own grief or certain things like that that existed pre-writing Bad Daughter versus post. And I do think without even realizing it or necessarily reliving it during the time, it was actually quite cathartic. So it's unique because I think a lot of people have looked at it and have wondered, oh wow, it must have been so difficult for you to write. And it really wasn't. So I don't know what that is. Is that, you know, you're healing through writing, it's the catharsis while it's happening, but it's very interesting for me to look back at, you know, how I felt pre-writing it versus now.
Yeah, I mean, the standard advice that I've heard all over the place is write what you know. And from that sense, if you have something to base it on that's personal and very
Totally.
emotional, it's like you said, maybe that's the reason why it took you a shorter time than you would have expected, the 3 months. So yeah, it's cool. And you mentioned about the genre of the novel. So this kind of novel is the first I've read of its kind, where it's kind of like a contained story.
Yeah.
There's one or two handfuls of characters that are
Yeah.
interacting with each other. My usual genres are like action thrillers or
Yeah.
sci-fi or dark horror. So those are
Yeah.
more like world expansive things. But what I
Yes.
liked about this was it's a contained story and it really focuses on um the like character development instead of like a plot as in like you're trying to achieve
Yeah.
a goal or a quest or something.
Yeah, it's very insular in that way. Like I would say the setting is quite insular. And I think it's interesting because one of the things that I did intentionally as well when I was writing it was I didn't actually ever describe Carly. And I don't know if anyone has picked up on that because a lot of people that know me have said they just pictured me in her place as the character, but I actually never gave her any physical description for that particular reason. I wanted her to be not anonymous, but I wanted anyone to be able to place themselves in her head. And it really is she, her head, her mind, her thoughts really are the setting of the novel. And in the same way, I actually never gave her a city that she lives in. I never
Yeah.
specify anything like that. I mean, given the timing, Thanksgiving takes place in October. Folks could probably assume it is Canada as opposed to the US. But that's interesting that you pick up on that because it is that was really the intention of it. And then, oh, I'm so sorry. And
It's all
then
good.
for the genre, I mean, again, it's literary fiction, so it, in many ways, is a bit of a catch-all for anything that's not close close defined. As you can see, there's a dog whipping around behind me. The
It's all good.
benefits of us being at home. So yeah, literary fiction is unique like that because you truly can do anything with it. To your point, you could do something that's very plot driven, that's very, you know, world building, really driven in that sense. But this was a very character driven piece for sure.
Yeah, I noticed a couple of things that, like you said, made it insular and kind of self-contained. One was I didn't pick up on the descriptions actually. I did also just imagine you because I had seen a picture of you for some reason. And then the Carly's boyfriend in the story, I imagined a guy I know who's named Jeremy. And like it didn't really match when you're describing like his hair because the guy I knew didn't have that much
Yeah,
hair. But it's just weird. That's just what happens. You just kind of like latch on to an image of a
totally,
person, and that's all you think about. So that was that,
totally.
and
So I mean, again,
yes,
no, go ahead, go ahead. That was the intention, right? So I love hearing that even though it didn't necessarily fit with Jeremy, you picked it kind of made sense in your head, right? So
yes. So yeah, there was that, and yeah, I didn't really think too much about the city, the setting. I didn't pick up on that, but now looking back on it, I would imagine it as Toronto, and I used to live in a small town of Perth, Ontario, which is in between
okay.
Kingston and Ottawa. So there's a bit where it takes part in a smaller town. That's what I was imagining
Yeah.
there. And the last thing I noticed was, wow, okay, I guess the like what do you call it? Like the professional characters had a last name, like a doctor this and a doctor that, but all the other characters are just on a first name basis, which was kind of nice because um, I, I felt like that was intentional and it worked in my opinion.
Totally, totally. Very intentional. And again, like I said, funny that most people picture me as Carly, but that was intentional. Like folks, that the characters that are kind of moving through that space with her. And funny you say that about the small town, because I am originally from a very small town and now live just outside of Toronto. So that's definitely what was going on in my head too when I was writing it, but was really meant for folks to be able to kind of put Carly anywhere that they felt she needed to be able to relate to her.
Cool. So yeah, I guess taking a step back, you mentioned you've been writing your whole life basically. Um, d so like, did you start off wanting to write more nonfiction, like the essays, and this just came across, or any background on
Yeah,
that?
so I think like throughout my life, I've definitely done a bit of both. I've dabbled in writing nonfiction and then writing fiction, and it's funny how things turn out, because I had actually intended to go to school to study English and creative writing and all of these things, but when I got to school, I really did not like my English section, and I couldn't switch because of a few other mandatory classes I had to take. And I ended up majoring in psychology and then going down this whole route of having like a health profession, being in healthcare. And so I kind of was away from writing for a bit of time. And then it really was just during the pandemic when I picked up my ancient MacBook that I was like, I'm afraid this thing's going to burn me or just die at any moment. You know how they get. That I started writing again, and what I started writing was fiction, and I've just kind of gone totally down that road. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't ever not, you know, I might write something nonfiction, because I do really enjoy sort of, again, like thought pieces, essays, things like that, personal kind of personal essays. So it's something I would consider, but I'm definitely in a fiction zone right now.
Cool. Cool. Um, so how did you get it published?
So super interesting. Bad Daughter, there's two different routes you can take for publishing. You can traditionally publish or you can independently publish. With Bad Daughter, I was going to go down the rabbit hole of traditional publishing and querying and all of that. It takes a very, very long time. People face a lot of rejections from agents and things like that. So I had originally planned on going down that way. I was going to query it to agents. And essentially, how the process works is if an agent likes your book, requests your manuscript, you sign with an agent, then they move through the process of trying to sell your book to a publishing house. Independent publishing can work a bit differently. So in that case, you can publish on your own, self-publish through a myriad of kind of various means. And the way it worked out is I decided that with Bad Daughter, I wanted it out there fairly quickly. So I never ended up actually querying it. And because it is at its core, I think, a personal story in many ways, I felt quite strongly about the creative control and certain things like that. So traditional publishing, that's another thing, is you do lose a little bit of creative control. You don't necessarily have a say over certain things, and the timeline is vastly different. It can take about 18 to 24 months for a traditionally published novel to hit the shelves. And so I decided that I would go through the independent publishing route. So I worked with a freelance editor, as well as like a freelance proofreader and whatnot. And interestingly enough, as that was going on, one of the individuals who edited for me actually founded an independent publishing company. And so how that works, a little bit, again, different than a big five traditional publishing house. So I now publish through her. And so I'd be what is considered a hybrid author, because essentially that's where you don't have an agent who's trying to sell your books. I work directly with my publisher.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I know very little about publishing, but I would imagine these days, because all the tools are there for people to write and publish online for
Exactly.
free, that
Exactly.
it's more advantageous for a personal story like this to take it that route.
I think so. And I do think, to that point, it is very accessible now to do online, in a myriad of different ways. You can do it directly through Amazon. You can do it through Barnes and Noble. You can do it through, I can't think of what the Chapters program is. They have I think it's a Kobo, not a Kindle. You can kind of do it through there. You can do it through Apple Books. Like, there's a myriad of ways you can do it. So I do find, and I mean, I'm quite connected into the independent author community just by association. It is a route that a lot of people choose for various reasons. One, creative control, timing, royalties are higher. Publishing is very, very hard to get into nowadays, especially because there's fewer publishing houses, and some of the bigger ones have kind of amalgamated, and so it's easy. It definitely is there, you know, six of one, half a dozen of the other. There's challenges with doing it both ways, for sure. Because if you're doing it independently and you're not attached to or associated with an independent publishing house like I am, you're doing a lot of your own marketing, you're doing a lot of your own branding and things like that, which can be really difficult.
Yeah, that's what I imagined because like the tools are there to write it and everything and get it published, or self-published or independently published. But the most difficult thing, in my opinion, maybe not for everybody, but for me personally, even with like a personal Instagram account, is like marketing or
Oh,
promotion. It's like I personally just
totally.
feel very weird. It's like, hey, look at me, look at what I did. But it's a little different when you're trying to sell something, obviously.
But no, I'm totally with you. That's where I think I struggle and why I really value having a publisher, an independent publisher, because I'm not good at that. It's not natural for me to be like exactly like, oh, here's my book, buy my book, all these things. And it's really wild actually how that industry has changed with things like Instagram and TikTok. I know so many independent or self-published authors who had one video go viral on TikTok for whatever reason, and their lives have totally changed, or they get picked up for book deals and things like that by big five publishing houses. So, but it is a bit it's a bit uncomfortable. I am a very self-deprecating person, so I'm quite honest on all my social that I'm not good at creating content. I'm never going to be good at coming up with like funny reels or anything like that. It's mostly just writing photos and photos of me like kind of poking fun at myself because that feels the most natural to me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I don't have too much experience with reels and little clips like that. But what I would like to try at some point. Um, Actually, I guess it wouldn't work so well with me, but what I would imagine is uh an option would be whether it's yourself or someone else reading little lines from the book, which you have kind of done. I've seen on some of your posts. You have the text format. Uh,
Yeah,
that's I think that's a good idea.
that's about the extent of my comfort. Like, I don't know if I would be comfortable putting myself in a reel, or like, I know a lot of people will kind of act things out or do the certain trends that are on TikTok or on Instagram. And I'm like, that's my extent goes. I'll maybe film my book and then I can put some quotes in front of it. That's about as much as I'm comfortable with right now. And I mean, for the people that do it the other way, more power to you. I'm envious. I wish I could put myself in front of the camera and, promote myself.
It's tough for me too personally. And yeah, like going viral is so crazy. So I actually used to work at Chapters as a part-time
Oh, okay.
uh person there. I did a little sales, but mostly I was early in the store, like getting books and products onto the floor. And they have a book talk page. So they
They
have like
do.
which is crazy. And they even have a table of that in the store. So yeah, it's wild. If you just go viral like that, you're literally like overnight, you'll be in front of everybody. Um,
It is totally, it's wild. And whenever I go into any sort of bookstore, same thing, like you see the trending on TikTok book talk things, and it's just the power of social media in our society. It's a great tool. I do have a TikTok. It's not very good. It's again very similarly. The only thing I'm really comfortable with is doing kind of quotes and aesthetic videos like that as opposed to putting myself in front of it. But maybe I'll get there
of
one
course.
day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll see how how things go. I'm curious. So you did get it published through your independent publisher. I know at the beginning of the pandemic, even a year or two in, there were delays in big publishers releasing books because there were some paper shortages. Did that affect you at all during this process?
It didn't, but I do have some author friends who did actually were impacted when they were selling their books. So a big platform that a lot of folks use and quite polarizing for some is Amazon because it's very easy to print through, and they were severely impacted by the paper shortages. So a lot of authors, I know their book was out there, it was published, their ebooks were live and things like that, but they were waiting months for author copies that they had perhaps, sold themselves or sold through kind of other venues because there was just no paper. So didn't impact me. I was fortunate to be on the other end of that, but I do know a lot of folks that were impacted by it.
Oh, that's good to know because I mean it's nice to hear that you weren't losing time or sales for your first publication, which is it's awesome.
Yeah, so I wasn't impacted there, but again, heart goes out to the folks that were because it's just such a bizarre thing.
Yes.
Like there's a paper shortage and it's I mean, I think there's lots of supply chain issues with things like that right now, but it was a very odd thing that many people were doing.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So yeah, I'm not really sure how much to get into about the book itself because I don't want to spoil things.
I know I was
Um,
debating saying something earlier to in response to one of your questions. I was like, oh, it's kind of a pivotal moment. I don't necessarily want to spoil it for people. So happy to vaguely answer as well as I can any questions you have without giving away too much.
okay. I'll just leave that aside for now and kind of take it as it comes up if about the plot points.
Sure.
Um, so okay, I guess I mean I don't really have a smooth flow, but since we talked about it earlier, your next novel is coming up. It's called Rich Girl,
Yes.
and I know nothing about it. So tell me, what's it about?
For sure. Okay, so happy to. And I actually just got my final proof copy of it today. So just making sure that everything looks good. So it's very different than Bad Daughter. It's still fiction. It would fall more into contemporary fiction than literary fiction. Um, I will say at the heart of my writing, I can read you the blurb momentarily, but is I definitely love a messy character. I think that my favorite thing to write about are characters who are messy, unpredictable, and perhaps are just as chaotic as they might be in real life. I don't find any of my characters to be particularly clean in that regard. I think about Carly in Bad Daughter, though she's not an antagonist by any means. She certainly makes certain choices that are I guess I'll just say, not the best in her relationships and the way she responds to people because of how her grief really impacts her. And I think that's sort of the central thing through all of my writing is whether it's, how our life circumstances have shaped us, whether it's trauma, whether it's, whatever it might be. And so that is, despite it being a very different story, definitely at the heart of Rich Girl. So I'm happy to read you the blurb if that works. I don't think my voice is as smooth for reading as yours is, but
Go
um,
ahead, please.
yeah, for sure. So the Winchesters are best known for being America's most elusive dynasty. Charlie Winchester is a rich girl. She has always been a rich girl, but her family's baggage comes with a price, and theirs is designer. When Charlie's mother died unexpectedly 7 years earlier, her family was left fragmented beyond repair. She has spent the years since her mother's death running from the family she can't seem to mend and the legacy she wants to escape. Forced to return home to Chicago after years of trying to avoid fixing herself by helping others, Charlie attempts to carve a name for herself and her own path in her family of generations company, Winchester Holdings. Although she has never had much success in the dating apartment, unlike her brother Deacon, whose life is an endless parade of dates and conquests, Charlie is surprised to find herself enamored with one of her colleagues. That is until someone from her past she attempted to bury along with her mother appears back in her life and turns everything she has worked to create upside down. So very different. I'm sure you can
Ooh,
already get different vibes.
yes, for sure. It sounds like just from the blurb, it's like I can sense the messiness of family relationships coming back.
Yes.
Um, and there's a mystery of who is this person from the past? Where is
Yeah,
this gonna
and
go?
very much so. And I think it's very I've gotten the comparison a lot to Gossip Girl, which is kind of funny if you're a
Oh,
millennial who grew up with that TV show. And one of
That's funny.
my advanced early readers said it, like a very good way to describe it is like messy rich people behaving badly.
Mm.
But it is really at the heart of that. It's contemporary fiction. There is, a romance piece to it, but it's not a romance novel. I don't really write romance novels. It's like contemporary fiction with romance in it, and romance is a whole other genre that people get into. But yes, very, very, very messy. These characters are a disaster in many ways, but in a good way, I think, for a reader. And I'm working actually on the sequel to it right now. So
Oh,
fingers
awesome.
crossed that will be done soon. But yeah, it releases in January. So excited for that one.
Cool. And oh, that's awesome. Wow. That's a quick turnaround, right? Oh, but yeah, you mentioned you started writing this before Bad Daughter. That's
Yeah,
yeah.
so I will say when I kind of paused writing Rich Girl, and I had been picking it up on and off for a few years, when I paused writing it to write Bad Daughter, I was about 40,000 words in, and it's just over 90. So I was about halfway. And then once I was done Bad Daughter, I kind of turned my attention back to Rich Girl. But again, that's another benefit of hybrid or independent publishing is you can be a lot quicker with your turnaround so long as your editor, whoever it is you're working with, can kind of fit you into your schedule like that and it makes sense for you. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
So I've been following you on Instagram a little bit, and you're doing a challenge, a writing challenge.
Yes.
What is it?
That's yeah, I was gonna mention that actually because it's called NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. And it's something that authors do every November where you aim to write 50,000 words in the month. So it averages out to be about 1,667 words a day. And so to finish the sequel to Rich Girl, which is called Lost Girl, I was about 20,000 words in, but it's due to my publisher in December. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to finish this. I'm going to do this challenge. So I am doing that. I'm just under 16,000 words, the 11th of November. So I'm moving along. My goal is to be at the halfway point of 25K by the end of the weekend. So we'll see if I get there.
Okay, yeah, all the best. Challenges are excellent ways to put the work in, the discipline into writing.
Yeah, and you know what? I think I function better just as a human being with deadlines. And so it's fun. They have a web page and everything for authors and stuff, and I have some of my author friends on there, and you can see how everyone's progressing, and you can kind of read about their works in progress and things like that. So it's been fun, but I think it's been good. I have not met the daily average every day, I will say, but I have had some days where I was way above the 1,600. So I have a bit of a cushion in the amount of words that I'm moving ahead. I'm not behind the schedule, so that's good.
That's awesome. Cool. Yeah, that the nano part of the I don't know, I guess it's not an acronym, but the whatever
Kind of,
the
yeah.
shortened form that caught my attention because I check out this website humblebundle.com. They usually sell like packages of ebooks or games or
Okay.
software, and they have a book bundle package called the Nano Writing Bundle. And it's some
Okay.
crazy like 30 books on how to write. Um, and then you can pay whatever you want. I don't work for them. I just mentioned that. I'm not trying to advertise them. But anyway, that's kind of why it caught my attention.
Yeah. A lot of people were like messaging me being like, what is this? I've never heard of this. And I was like, it's definitely a very, again, like insular into the reading or author community, but funny you've seen it elsewhere. There are whole websites on like how to prep for nano. It's a whole thing. So I'm not surprised to hear that there's somewhere where you could get kind of all of your writing books and things like that in one place to really get there. One of my friends is actually at like 30,000 words already. So she is just moving along very, very quickly at a quicker pace than I am, but
Do you find that as you're writing during this challenge or in general, do you rely on your writer friends for motivation or to like hold yourself accountable? Is that even a factor?
yeah, that's a great question and a great thought. So I definitely check in with other author friends and writing friends a lot, or I'll run certain things by them if I'm like, I'm not really sure what to do in this situation. I'm not a plotter. I don't really plot out my books. in the writing world, if you're not a plotter, you're called a pantster, because it means you fly by the seat of your pants.
Yeah.
And so I'm definitely one of those. I do very, very, very loose outlines, and then I kind of just see where things go. Like things have taken totally different directions, and sometimes they do. But I definitely check in, and I will say it's a very supportive community of people to run things by one another. And I mean, something we definitely do for each other. It's a process that I don't think a lot of folks are familiar with. But when you're in the process of publishing a novel, before you do advanced readers, which are folks who are solely readers, they're reading an advanced copy of your book. Folks will either do alpha reading or beta reading. And so I beta read for a lot of my author friends, which essentially means after they have kind of had their first look through, their first edit, or even sometimes a first developmental edit with their editor, depending on how their process is, you then read through it as both an author and a reader to make suggestions about plot, characters, anything like that, sort of to poke holes in things, to make suggestions for what can be improved or other options, or if they have specific questions for you. So I do that a lot for other authors as well, so reading through their novels and their work to kind of to help shape it into a better kind of final product that's just a piece of the editing a phase that I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that, because my typical image of an author, of what an author is like a person who's secluded, just like writing for hours on end by
Yes,
themselves. But this makes more sense that, you can't just write all day. You got to do something else. If you can help out your friends, um, there's also marketing, etc. So that makes
totally. And
sense.
I think the beta reading process, and I just reading in general as an author, I think makes you a better writer. But I do find beta reading to be particularly helpful because I mean it's given me inspiration, or when I'm poking a hole, and I say that and I mean that in a kind way, not, you're definitely not tearing apart anyone's manuscript or anything like that, but thinking, okay, here's a minor plot hole, or here's something else you can find. It makes me reflect on my own work with that same kind of more critical lens that I don't have when I'm going through, because I'm not, when I'm writing, I'm definitely exactly that. I don't really plot and I don't edit as I go. I wait until everything is done, and then I take one kind of brief look at things before it goes for the first developmental edit with my publisher. But it's actually very helpful for my own critical thought when I'm like looking at my own words on the page.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, yeah, is it like, what's your experience writing versus reading it for the first time? Do you um is it different? Like, obviously when you're writing it, it's a different process, because you're by way of being a pantser, as you said, you're kind of coming up with the plot as you go, and then when you're reading it back, is it like, oh wow, that's not bad. I thought this went better than I wrote it.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both. Like sometimes I've read things and been like, wow, I am a literary genius. I am so good. And then other times I've
Yeah.
read stuff and I'm like, that is trash. Like, what was I thinking when I did that? And so I do think it's definitely helpful for me personally because I don't plot to do a read through before I send it to my editor and publisher. Whereas I know some folks who are like hardcore plotters, like down to whether they use like the act. There's different ways you can plot. You can do something called it's a very popular book in writing called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and it's about how your book should have 15 beats. So I know some people who are like very specific will plot out what's called a whole beat sheet to move through, or people who write in like act 1, act 3, act 1, act 2, act 3 kind of structure. A lot of people I know that plot intensely don't read through their work, but like for someone like me, I need to, because I might have been going in a totally different direction at the start, and some things don't make sense anymore. But it can be a joy, but also very humbling to read your own work when you realize wasn't your finest.
Hmm. I like that approach, because that's what I struggle with. I've tried writing little short stories, and then I'll feel great for like the first, I don't know, like 10 pages or whatever, and then I'll have no ideas how to move forward, and then I'll just give up on it. So I think it's a good approach, I could imagine it being good for me personally because I don't want to imagine a full story, but kind of have a start or an outline and then write it whatever, is does it suck? Is it great? Who cares? Just write it and then come back, revisit it and take what you like.
Absolutely. I mean, that works for me too. And I often find like I change my mind as I go. And I think, there's a lot of pressure in publishing and just in writing in general, like everyone, saying like, well, if this doesn't move the story forward, cut it, and all of these things that I think in my writing experience, sometimes you need to write filler, exactly that, just to move along. So I would totally recommend, if you're someone who is trying to write and is maybe struggling, just like write something, a filler scene or something for fun. Or something else I do that I feel like is my instant cure to writer's block is, because I do have like a very loose outline, I also don't necessarily write chronologically. So sometimes
Oh.
like I will skip ahead and write a scene or a chapter that I know is coming way later that I'm excited about. And I will often do that if I'm stuck. I'm like trying to get past a certain thing, because I'm like, okay, I can keep moving. I'll go ahead and I'll write this. And so I know a lot of people that works for is, if you're stuck, writer's block, go write something you're excited about.
That's a great idea. I had never thought of that before at all because I mostly read. So when I'm imagining writing, I'm just like imagining it as a story sequentially. But
Totally.
yeah, like for example, when you were explaining about writing not chronologically, my mind went to reading mangas,
Yeah.
the Japanese comics. A lot of times they have flashbacks and then like chapters later, like 30, 40 chapters, they'll tie everything together. And then you'll be like, wow, this guy planned it from the start. And like it seems like it's a plotter, but it could just be
Might
that,
not
I
be.
like this. Let's just take a detour. Let's make this story. We'll figure out how to tie it up at the end. So I love that because you can kind of write episodically and then
Yeah.
you can cut out episodes, right? And
Totally. Totally. And I mean, actually, in Bad Daughter, interestingly enough, this isn't giving anything away plot wise, but Carly is a pathologist, a pathology assistant, and that really plays into a lot of her personal feelings about her father, and I think really drives her character forward, and makes obviously certain things happen at her workplace that I'm not going to get into, but that actually is quite central to her arc and her journey, is what she's kind of forced to experience and face at work. She was originally an editor, which was totally different. And so I had
uh,
originally had her as an editor. And the kind of work thing that she was going through was that she wanted a promotion and interviewed for this job. And she did end up getting it, but then ended up needing to take a leave, whatever. And it was meant to represent how much she had given up, to focus in on work, which I didn't really lose with her role as a pathology assistant. But it was very tonally different when I finished the book. Like everything that took place at work when she was an editor felt a lot lighter. It was a lot more lighthearted. It didn't really fit with everything else that's going on throughout the book. And when that was pointed out to me, which was through the editing process, I was like, you know what, that's right. And so I scrapped like whole chapters, whole storylines, different characters that kind of fit into that, because this idea of her in a hospital, in a morgue, in looking at tissue all day, looking at diseased tissue, fit a lot better with the storyline. So it was a very different book, actually, when I reflect on that.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I would agree the pathology career choice that you made definitely works better. I haven't read your editor drafts, obviously, but just the fact of kind of how the hospital and disease and that kind of stuff ties into the whole story arc, as well
Totally.
as work being a safe place for her and what
Yeah.
happens when there are problems there. It kind
Yeah.
of it adds a layer of connectivity, I guess I would say.
Totally. I can't actually imagine the book now if she was still an editor. Like it's one of those very odd things that I don't even know why I wrote that in the first place. And I was pretty hesitant when I was looking through the draft and had to kind of that was one of the edit notes I received, was exactly that. Like, it's very tonally different, and it almost felt like you're reading a different book, and the stakes really weren't high enough, with this whole idea of her wanting a promotion and all of these things. And I was very hesitant to cut some of these chapters because some of them felt to me, even though they were different, I really liked the writing. I liked the interplay with kind of the other characters, but ultimately it was actually for the best. I remember when I hit just like the big delete button and then just kind of got in the zone, came up with this other idea, and it definitely felt a lot better. So happy to hear that you feel like, even though obviously you haven't read the other one, but knowing that that was an option for her, that this is a better choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, wow. Yeah.
Hard to imagine,
Yeah.
right? Like, I think about it now, like, it's so different.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine because the writing aspect of it, I, I I don't know how it would tie into other stuff in the story.
It
Um,
didn't really, I guess. Like,
yeah,
that's the thing. And I don't know why I ever placed her there. And then when it clicked to me, and again, I know we're kind of skirting around certain plot points because don't want to necessarily
yeah,
give anything away. Like, it's just a much better kind of representation of how grief has really seeped into all
yes.
parts of her life, right? And it's interesting because I think one of the things that I like about, well, of course I like my book, but that I was really trying to get out there with it is that grief, and we see this in Carly a lot, it's not necessarily always just sadness. I think people think of grief as sadness solely. It's anger, it's confusion, it's all of these other things. And I think her different job, her different career choice helps to really highlight that.
Mhm. I'm gonna take a little bit of a detour here. Um,
Sure.
kind of on the topic of grief. Um, if you're comfortable sharing, in your personal experience, kind of
Totally.
what's your experience of what grief is? You kind of mentioned it already. And are there typically there are moments that people remember that kind of um, highlights the extent of grief. It's always hard to describe it. Like
It,
I'm trying to put it into words without having experienced something like that myself. So I'll leave the floor to you to.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm happy to chat about it because, again, it is, Bad Daughter was, it is fiction, but it is a fictionalized version of a lot of things that did happen to me, or it's a very dramatized version of what happened to me during that period. Or some of it is totally made up, but all, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the feelings are all real. They were all real, whether they have been kind of exacerbated, drawn out, or put in a different situation for the sake of the book. And so there are certain things like this that actually happened. So one, the start of the book, it's that you read out, it's framed very differently. But one of the reasons I wanted to start the book that way is because there was a time when right before my father passed, that like very similarly, I showed up at the hospital, and like similar to what happens to Carly, it was like a gut punch, seeing how different my father looked and then how quickly it devolved. And so very similarly, says the writer, like it can be really hard to put into words, but it's very visceral. And I think that's what I tried to capture with Carly and her emotions, and kind of the way they move through the book. And this one thing in particular, and I won't get into the specifics, but her overarching feelings of why, of it being her fault, of why she thinks it's her fault, and her fault that he died, all of these things, that was really kind of a manifestation, I think, and meant to represent like many of the various confusing feelings that I had, though the exact event didn't happen to me, that didn't exactly shape up that way. It was meant to really be a representation of all of those different things that I felt. And I, interestingly enough, I was connecting with a friend recently who very, very recently lost her father to cancer as well. And she had started the book before and then kind of finished it afterwards. And she was saying like so many other things just took on a totally different meaning for her. Very interestingly, one of the pieces of the book that she highlighted was one of the things you shared about, she's like, I never would have actually been able to viscerally picture what it was like to see someone who was dying until and then it took on a totally different meaning when I read you describe it. And so I think that's why I use a lot of description and imagery. And it's can be quite, I guess, dark in some ways, but that's really it's meant to kind of tap into how that actually feels, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think the powerful effect of um in general sharing your experience, and more specifically writing a dramatized version of your experiences of how Carly's feeling, what kind of despair and grief she's feeling. The the powerful thing about that is when someone who reads it has experienced something, it's very personal, and it's a way to um for lack of a better term, kind of sit with those feelings. Like when you're reading it,
100%.
you know someone wrote this way. They must know what it's like, or they must know someone who has done the experienced this. And on the other hand, for me, who has not experienced this kind of grief and despair yet, I'm sure it will come because that's the nature of life. Um, it's it's like it's kind of like a simulation in a way. You're going through a story. You're just like, I don't know. It's like I don't know how to explain it, but
I know what you mean, and you touched on something very specific, which I think was one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book, is because as Carly's feelings for her father were very complicated, because it was a lot about one, forgiving herself, but also forgiving others for both the people they were and then the people they weren't in our lives. I think is a really big theme there. What that is all true. Those, I mean, again, the specific events not necessarily true, but like my post death relationship with my father is very complicated for similar reasons. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to put that out there is exactly that, because it is such an isolating and complex feeling, to have these thoughts of, again, there's, without giving specifics, there's one scene that I particularly really resonate with and feel quite deeply when Carly is in the therapist's office and her therapist says, you have so much to grieve about. And she basically says, like, what do I have to grieve about? I wished for his death, all these things. Then it devolves into her whole kind of her complication. And since then, I've heard from some folks who have read it that they said, like, I felt like I was reading my own words. And it was so important to me to be like, okay, these complicated feelings I have that I don't want to say out loud, or that I'm afraid to say out loud because I don't want people to take them the wrong way. Like that, it was very actually comforting for them to see that someone else felt the same and that it was okay.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like ever since I was young, I've I mean, I'm sure everyone goes through this, but you have kind of rampant thoughts if you're stressed out. They kind of build on each other. You could be self-deprecating or be upset about something you said or didn't say, or an event felt like, you should have said something and it went the wrong way. Um, Unfortunately for me, only time kind of illustrates the fact that just because you're thinking something doesn't mean you have to put value in it. If you're blaming yourself for something, that's kind of the nature of the mind.
Humanity. Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think
it's
that
yeah. Go
that's
ahead.
a big piece of it too, is just that I wanted it to, like, she made mistakes as a daughter in the same way that her father made mistakes as a parent. In my real life, I made mistakes, but so did my dad, so did my mom, so did other people in my family. Everybody does. Like, it really is in many ways just that's human nature, that's humanity, and that's okay. We're all going to make mistakes. And it's a little bit about letting yourself off the mat in many ways. And I think though my grief experience and the kind of spectrum of emotions Carly goes through didn't take place in 1 year, 5 years after my dad died, that was something that I really struggled with too, was really exactly that, like letting myself off the mat for the things that I had done wrong and the mistakes that I made. Because, at the end of the day, we all could always do better, and people, we're just going to make mistakes. And exactly like you said, what heals that but time and giving yourself a bit of grace.
Yes, and yeah, in this case, reading that someone else has written it when you're not comfortable saying things or having thoughts that you think are like if you're blaming yourself for someone's death,
Yeah.
it's it. it's always good to talk about it, but not everyone's comfortable. So hopefully, they can get some kind of something out of reading that experience. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful thing, I think.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to hear that. And that's what means the most to me is if someone can tell me they got one thing out of the book in one way at all. That makes me happy, and it makes everything worth it to have. Like I said, it wasn't painful to write or anything like that. I did experience a bit of nerves. What's the word? Like the day that it was published, the day that it was released out into the world, and it wasn't second guessing it, but that was probably the time that I experienced the most like nerves about putting emotions like that out there. Even though it is fiction, like I felt very vulnerable, but it passed very quickly. But that was probably the only time that I had like a little bit of like, oh, I'm struggling with this. And then it did devolve into just I was totally comfortable with it. And as people read it and had positive things to say or said they related to it, that felt much that helped to kind of assuage that. So
Yeah, it's like, all right, here's a whole bunch of my thoughts, emotions, doubts.
exactly.
Uh
And I think because I knew so many people that bought the book and I knew them personally, I like had this moment of like, oh, all these people are actually going to read this. And I mean,
oh yeah.
it's settled, like it's settled. But I just was like, oh, a lot of people that I know or people that I grew up with or went to school with, I'm like, oh, I don't think I want everybody reading this. But obviously, it all turned out fine.
I get the same feeling when someone tells me that they listened to a podcast episode. I'm like, oh, ugh, okay.
I
I
can
wonder
totally
what they're gonna
imagine
say.
that. Yeah, I can totally imagine that. It's very, even if you're talking about something that's like much more lighthearted, right? Like you are putting yourself out there. It's a different form of expression, different form of art. And I can totally appreciate that being nerve-wracking too.
Mm. Yeah, I was just gonna kind of switch to kind of less intense, serious stuff. But
Yeah.
is there anything you um wanted to say about whatever we've talked about that maybe we didn't cover?
No, I think, the biggest things that I always want to stress about the story in general are exactly what I said, that it's grief isn't always sadness, and that it really is in many ways, I think, a story of forgiveness for others and for yourself. Those are kind of the big things I always share. There's this kind of known thing, if you're a writer or an author and someone else asks you to describe your work or tell you what it's about, it's like one of the worst questions in the entire world because I feel like I totally clam up and I'm like, I don't know what I wrote my book about. So those are
Right.
kind of the two things that I'm always like, yeah, it's about this. So
That's good. So I'm curious, do you have authors that you would consider your influences in how you write?
oh, that's a great question. So I don't find that like my prose or anything is particularly similar to or inspired by any one author. I I had this question asked to me recently in a kind of a book kind of club sort of thing I was doing, and I was actually really struggling to think of anyone I think from an emotional standpoint. I don't know if you've ever read John Green. He was a very popular
Oh,
for millennials. He wrote Fault in Our Stars,
Looking for
for
Alaska?
Alaska. Yes. So like
Yep.
Looking for Alaska was a very important book to me when I was younger. And so I think in many ways I would lean into more the way in which he tells stories. I find is similar to mine in the sense that like I'm inspired by that it's not just what it is on the surface, kind of in the way that I described Rich Girl. It's not just a girl who's working and dating someone at the office. There's a lot more to it. There's always a more of a hidden message, or there's kind of this theme that works throughout about grief, trauma, mental health, anything like that. That's something that's really important to me, that I find that he reps, as do many other authors, is the real impact of mental health, mental illness. And that's one of the things that I always like to portray in my books in a very real way, or what I try or hope is a very real way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I've read Looking for Alaska. I've also read his other book, An Abundance of Catherines. I think there's
I
another
haven't read
one.
that one actually.
I haven't read The Fault in Their Stars. I feel like I read another one, but I can't remember. But in any case, just about looking for Alaska. Yeah, I kind of get that somber vibe. This is just
Yeah.
this might just be the way I read books. I find I just have like a somber narrative voice for some reason. But yeah, I could definitely see that for sure.
Yeah, I would say, like, in comparison to many authors that I connect with, my books are more on the depressing side. It doesn't mean that there's not fun in them or, humor. Like Rich Girl, for example, there's a lot of things that I would actually consider to be humorous, like interactions between the characters and things like that. But at its heart, it's not a it's not a happy story. And certainly Bad Daughter isn't a happy story either. So that's definitely one thing. And I have author friends who very similarly write kind of content like that as well. But there's definitely an appetite for readers. They want a happily ever after, no matter what the no matter what it is. I was actually just about to spoil something about Bad Daughter. I won't, but something that happens, I did get with one of Carly's relationships, I did get a lot of flack from people about that they didn't not that they didn't
Oh
like the
yeah, yeah.
way, yeah, I think you know where I'm going. Not that they didn't like how it ended, but they had wanted something different. So
I can say personally, I don't have an opinion on whether it was good or bad, but I didn't see it coming, which I always like when I'm reading something. I'm like,
okay.
wait, what? Why? And then I was like, okay. I mean, it makes sense. Like,
I think that was what the general thing that I got from people is that they were surprised by it, but it made sense when they thought about it, but wanted it to have a different kind of resolution at the end. I think I left it open to interpretation. So if those people want to imagine something different, they can.
yeah, it sucks for the other end of that relationship, I think. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's life. um,
Yeah, right?
so yeah, John Green. Okay, I could see that. Any other influences you think?
So, what's really interesting? I read a ton of, I mean, I'll read anything. I read a ton of fantasy and I don't write fantasy. Um,
Yes.
so like it's very hard for me to be like, oh yeah, this person, this person. I don't actually read a ton of contemporary fiction, which is what I write.
Hmm.
I read if I was going to pick something up, I would pick up probably a fantasy novel. I don't know if it's because it's so different than what I write that I like to kind of escape there. I have been told by people that have read it early that Rich Girl is very much like Emily Henry. I'm not sure she's a big contemporary fiction author right now. She wrote Beach Read, Book Lovers, People Meet on Vacation, but all of her characters are very
Right.
morally gray, which I would agree that most of my characters tend to be, and certainly in Rich Girls. So I have been told that it's quite similar and writing style is quite similar as well. I actually haven't read any of her work, so I'm going when I go after my third book, like when Lost Girl is done, turned into my editor and publisher, I will dive into some and I'll see if the comparison rings true.
I totally get that you read different than you write because I love reading sci-fi and action thrillers, but I would never imagine myself trying to write those.
Yeah, I would love to say I could write a fantasy because it's a very big genre right now and it does very well and I love it. I think it's so fun. I can't even imagine trying to like world build like that. I don't think I'd be
Yeah.
good at it. I don't think I'd be good at it unless it was a very, very simple world because again, everything I write is very character driven and I'm not sure that lends super well to that genre, right? Kind of going back to one of your earlier comments, like no one's on a quest. They're not trying to
Yeah,
solve
yeah,
something.
yeah.
There's not an evil force kind of, stopping them from doing something. So I'm not sure I'd be good at that, but
Mm, cool.
maybe
Um,
someday.
and sticking to the topic of authors, is there maybe one or two authors that uh you've read their work and you admire something about it that maybe you're trying to incorporate, or maybe you're just like, oh, I don't know how they're doing this.
Oh yeah, for sure. So there's a author that I'm friends with. She's also an independent author. Name's Lindsay Cord, and I just think she writes such very emotional, I would say very emotional stories. And I just think she has such a way of kind of connecting her characters to the reader. But there's one thing that she does that I really don't think I would ever do that I really admire is she can throw in a twist. Like it's so a lot of her books really start in kind of like a flash. How do I want to say this? Like they start with this like present event without giving away. I just recently beta read one of her upcoming novels that's going to be released in the new year. But I'm always just like, how did you do that? You know, there's one thing very similar to what we were just saying until the end of the book. I did not see that coming. And they almost border on not thrillers, but that's the kind of twisty vibes I feel like she gives in her contemporary fiction, women's fiction work. And so I'm always very much in admiration of people that can really throw like a wild twist like that. Very similarly, I would never write a thriller because I don't think I'd be good at it. And I think there's certain things that are, like you said, certain things in Bad Daughter people didn't see coming. I've heard that from early readers in Rich Girl that there were certain things they didn't see coming, but it's not a twist. And so people like that can leave like their little clues along the way without necessarily giving something away. I think that's quite a feat. Very similarly, there was a very popular book this summer called Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. She's a Canadian author, actually. She's from Toronto. She wrote it, being from Perth. I'm not sure if you're familiar with where Barry's Bay is. She,
No.
okay, so it's in like the Renfrew Valley, like the Ottawa Valley area,
Okay.
so which is where I grew up. And so she wrote this story about two kind of best friends in childhood. Anyway, just again, the book was just the way she wrote it, like with the past flashing back and forth between past and present is something that I really admire that people can do very seamlessly to blend a story. There's flashbacks in Bad Daughter and in Rich Girl, but doing that like actual constant past present flip flop, I think is very it's quite intricate, and I really admire folks that can do that.
Yeah. Cool. Um, what are you reading now?
I am not reading anything at this current moment, but I have a very, very long TBR pile for when I'm done my book that I can finish. I'm behind on a book club book called The Cold uh, I don't remember what it's called, but it's by Sloane James, The Book of Cold Cases. So it was supposed to be like a spooky season read. Again,
Uh,
I will read anything. So I haven't I'm not reading anything at this moment in time that's new. Sometimes I'll thumb back through previous books that I have read, just, you know, needing to distract while I'm not when I'm writing. I did a lot of beta reading for friends this summer as well. So I was mostly primarily reading unpublished pieces from some of my friends, but I will take any recommendation because I'm looking forward to when I'm done my current book to diving back in and to taking a little bit of a writing break.
are you looking for fiction or nonfiction?
Anything. I will read anything. I love, like I know you mentioned horror, anything like that. I love all sorts of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, there's this London author. Uh, his name is Drew Murray. I just
Okay.
came across him because I think one day I was Googling London authors and there was a CBC article. So I just bookmarked it and I bought his book.
Okay.
It's called Broken Genius.
Okay. I'll have to check it
It's
out.
and so the premise is there's a tech CEO in the States with a privacy software. At the start of the book, this privacy software ends up in somebody getting killed, and
Okay.
it's a secret. And so, skip a few years later, he's working for the CIA, and then he has
Okay.
to solve solve some kind of mystery. There's some murders. There's a Comic Con. It's a pretty fun
Okay.
read.
Okay. I'll definitely check that out. One of my friends, who's a writer as well, sent me a book today that I think will maybe be one of the first ones I read. Just gonna go try to find. It's like something about a Christmas murder mystery. Anyway, it seemed like it would be quite good. It was like very much Clue vibes, like the board game.
Yeah.
And so it's let me just see if I can find it because it seemed like it was a good one. Um, and I can't remember the title, of course, as we're chatting.
It's actually a funny that you mentioned Christmas murder mystery because when I used to stock or put books on shelves of chapters, there's like
Yeah,
a whole section of Christmas mystery books with murders.
that's interesting because I feel like what's very popular right now, or I see trending a lot, is not necessarily Christmas murders, but like Christmas romances, Christmas rom-coms. People are loving that sort of holiday thing, which reminds me of like, the classic Hallmark movie. I
Mhm.
found it. So it's actually literally called The Christmas Murderer Game. Um, and so I think that might be the first one I picked up. It seems very interesting and just a little bit different than certainly anything I've been writing. So it might be fun to try that out.
That's cool. Um, is there one or two books that you uh look back as wow, that's like it's like a formative read? I think we talked about one of them, but yeah,
Looking
whatever
for
you got to say.
Alaska for sure, but there's two others that are again completely different. Dracula was it
Oh,
remains like my favorite book ever. I read it when I was very young, so that to me is like a huge formative read. Looking for Alaska was as well, but also there's this book by an author called Sarah Manning, and it's called Pretty Things, and it's about four kind of post high school, pre college teens in London who are in a drama camp over the summer. And it kind of follows them each sort of, it's like a little bit of coming of age as they kind of develop these new friendships, these new relationships, and kind of find themselves. And that is one of the books that I look back on. I reread so often, so frequently, and was very much a formative piece for me.
hmm.
I'm not even sure if it's still in. I don't even know if you could still get it. It's still in publication because it was so long ago, but it was great.
Yeah, like I think back to some of my formative books. It was probably like between the ages of 9 and 14. Um, like what's it called? There's this trilogy of books. Actually, now there are four by this British author named Jonathan Stroud. It's kind of fantasy-ish.
Okay.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's like the Bartimaeus trilogy.
Oh, okay, I
Um,
think I've heard of that.
you might have, yeah. Uh, it's uh, it's like a fantasy book about. It's set in London, I think in modern
Okay.
times, which was 10 years ago or 15 years ago,
Yeah.
but there's no computers. So it's like
Oh,
magical.
interesting.
There's genies and spirits, and
Okay.
this kid wants to take revenge on some other magician, and he summons like this very nefarious, witty Jin, I guess, not genie. They
Yeah.
kind of pronounce it differently. So anyway, that I don't know why that was formative, but I just remember that was pretty cool.
One of those things, right? Like you never know, but I think people they can pick out those certain books that I mean, again, mine very bizarre, spanning many different genres, like Dracula of all books, but it's just one of those things that stuck with me and I reread over and over. And
Would that be so are all those three on your list of books that you've reread a lot or have reread?
yeah, totally. And I mean, there's certain other books that I will reread. Certain fantasy series books, like a very popular one is A Court of Thorns and Roses. I'm sure you've heard of, I don't know if you've heard of that, Sarah J. Maas. It's kind of like a
I've seen
musical.
them all the time.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's very, very popular. I'll reread those just like if I want to kind of pick something up. And but yeah, those are I would say three of the ones that I would reread pretty constantly.
Mm, cool. Yeah, I find like for the formative books that I think of or look back on fondly, I don't necessarily reread them. And now that I'm a lot older, now I actually
Mhm.
want to reread books
Yeah.
instead of trying to find new books, which is very strange. It's like a new feeling. It's like I'm not
Yeah.
looking for new anymore. I'm trying to unpack the old.
Yeah, and I've heard actually someone told me it's like an anxiety response if you want to reread because it's like a comfort thing. I was like, that's interesting. That would track with me if it's something, you're just like nervous about something new. But I find I do that a lot. I go through phases where I'm either constantly rereading things or when I'm not writing, or I'm just burning through new books, like one after the other after the other. I flip flop.
This was awesome.
Okay, I was just saying thank you. I don't know if you heard
Okay.
that. Just thank you so much. Super, super happy to chat and fun to just do something a bit different. And let me know if there's anything you need from me at all, and happy to share whenever it's out.